I do want to point out that I am still employed by the Fed, so I have to tell you that these are my conclusions and do not indicate concurrence by other members of the research staff or the board itself. So this is a great opportunity. Thanks, John, for inviting me. Papers like this, Mike and Suzanne's paper, now working with Phil, on the HRS are always a great thing to talk about. There's often very little to say because it's great data and it's very carefully done. So I'm going to take the usual discussant approach of adding a little bit of color using other data, particularly my work with the Survey of Consumer Finances and some income tax data, and then end with some philosophical musings about life cycle models in general, sort of getting back to things we were talking about yesterday. So the main takeaway is cash outs are more likely given an adverse shock, and my main question here would be, what fraction of cash outs are not associated with these sorts of measurable shocks? I think there's evidence here and in other work I've done that we see a lot of sort of regular cashing out that is in some ways more disturbing to our beliefs about the life cycle model and the sort of underlying principles for income tax preferences for these sorts of saving programs. The second is that cash out rates are rising over time. And here I would ask, is this because of the shift from DB to DC, or is it really specific to this one cohort in the recession, or is it something worse, that income volatility, job changes becoming systematically different over time? Even though unemployment rates are back down, is it still the case people are going to have more volatility in employment? And then the last thing is the longer term outcomes are worse given the cash out, but the baselines were also worse, and allowing the cash outs, I think this was fairly compelling at the end, did not impair retirement readiness. But here's where I'll do some philosophical musing and think about how do these cash outs interact with other life cycle decisions that are also sort of inconsistent with the standard model. So with that, we'll start with the shocks, and I'll point out that work I've done with income tax data confirmed that the shocks are really correlated with early withdrawals from retirement accounts. Here in the income tax data, we focused on the group right before the one that Mike and Suzanne and Phil are looking at, less than 55, because in the income tax data, you really can't tell that it was an early withdrawal, but before age 55, we can assume. The tax data also show, though, that these high withdrawal rates occurred given no measured shocks, and the early withdrawal rates did not surge in the Great Recession. So this first table breaks it down by the two columns are did you have a job change or no job change, and then the rows are did you have no shocks, and then we allow two shocks that we can measure with the income tax data. Income shocks, meaning your income fell by 10% or more the year that you had the cash out, or a marital shock, and we can tell you had a marital shock because you went from being a joint filer to being a single filer. And then we can look at whether or not you had both shocks. And all of this is fitted, and these are the predicted values. And the main point from this first red box is that if you have an income shock, you're twice as likely, given job change, to have a withdrawal as no shock, but it's still the case that 13.8% of people who have evidence of retirement plan coverage had a withdrawal, even without a job change in any given year. There's a lot of churning. If you thought you saw a lot of sort of withdrawal activity in Michael's presentation, I think the tax data is even more clear about that. And if we just zoom in on the group that had no shocks, 7.7% with no job change, 13.8% given a job change had some sort of withdrawal. So it's very prevalent. It's not just about shocks. This chart, we've got 4 lines. The 2 shocks that we were looking at are plotted. So the income shock is the blue line. We're looking over time, and we see that it does peak up in 2008. But income tax data also shows there's a lot of inherent volatility throughout this period. We had almost 20% of people less than 55 who experienced more than a 10% income drop. And, but it did peak up, by almost 10 percentage points in the recession. But the black line, which shows the non-penalized, the net taxable withdrawal, so that's penalized and non-penalized, red line is the penalized, doesn't show nearly as much increase. Now this does end in 2010. We haven't updated the numbers. This might have gone up, but part of why we think this is happening is because job separations also sort of fell dramatically during this time period. If people had jobs, they didn't leave them. But the other thing is there's a strong correlation between whether you have retirement plan coverage to begin with and whether you experience one of these shocks. That's why the blue line goes up, but it doesn't go up quite as dramatically. So this does suggest that that just what's happening with the economy is not the main driver. Again, my emphasis would be on the fact that this is regular, recurring activity, not so much on the shocks. One more point from the tax data is that this occurs across all income groups. So we don't tend to think of this as, or the tax data indicates this is not just a phenomenon among the lower half of the income distribution. It's very widespread. So here the two lines are the black lines, you have no shocks, solid line, no job change, dotted line, you had a job change. Again, and here we're looking across income groups, and this is income minus the withdrawal itself. So it's a good measure of income averaged over 3 years. And what you see is that it's almost as high at the top as it is at the bottom in terms of withdrawal rates. So it's, again, a very widespread phenomenon. The tax data confirms that. So here my suggestion to the authors would be to help us to understand how much of what you're seeing in the data is shock driven. We know that the coefficients are positive, they're significant. It's clear that the shocks are driving additional cash outs, but I'd really like to see what those differences are and whether or not the HRS confirms this phenomenon of widespreadness by income for the group who's nearing retirement. So the second question is, why are cash outs rates rising over time? The power of the HRS really comes through here, that you see these different cohorts. We're seeing them at the same point in the life cycle, and we do see that they're rising over time. So there's a couple explanations, DB versus DC, or the changing economic environment. So in the paper, tables 4 and 5, there's a bunch of reasons or things that the dispositions, what happened when somebody separated, are not mutually exclusive. It was a little hard to compare across cohorts, but I had a few quick takeaways. And Michael really emphasized this, and I can't emphasize it enough. The knowledge of the cash out option in surveys is very suspect. We're right in the middle of the 2016 SCF, and as we're reviewing these cases when they come in and we're looking at people's knowledge of their pensions, it comes through over and over again that people are quick to say, no, I don't have a cash out option, but in fact they do. And I'm a little worried that the cash out option might be correlated, or the knowledge of the cash out option may be correlated with income itself, which actually does kind of throw the IV a little bit into suspect, right? That if you're higher income and you know you have a cash out, you're more likely to say you have a cash out, and that could actually be affecting the estimates. But condition on that, I mean, it is true that if you go back to the tables where I think I took your first set of tables where you didn't condition on whether you had a cash out option. Just look at sort of overall dispositions. And there you see that DBs do have a lower cash out rate, but it's closing in on DC. This is an interesting phenomenon over time. The change in DC, again, not conditional on knowledge of a cash out, was mostly about the other category in 92 relative to cash out in 04. So I'm not sure I saw a clear trend there either. I'm not sure what other meant in 92. And the change in DB is mostly from benefits to rollover. So my suggestion would be to try and do something in terms of thinking about, what's driving this change in cash out behavior over time. Whether this is some sort of Oaxaca blinder decomposition or something like that, where you're effectively trying to run a counterfactual on the 2004 data using estimates from the earlier cohorts, plugging in counterfactual shocks to see how much of the change in cash out behavior is being driven by the shift in pension design versus the actual shocks, and just to know how much incrementally are shocks changing cash out behavior over time. Okay, so on to the last part is cash outs and life cycle outcomes. So the first question I would pose is, are we really surprised that the availability of cash outs did not affect readiness for the 92 cohort measure? I should say I'm a huge fan of the readiness measure. The Herd readiness measure really takes into account a lot of things that normal life cycle logic doesn't. For example, especially the declining consumption pattern we see in real data. But it raises the question, how should we modify the standard life cycle model to incorporate the new facts? And then, if we really want to take it to the next level, and the whole point of this gathering, how should we think about retirement savings tax policy in response to emerging trends and whatever model we really think is driving people's behavior? So the cash outs and economic well-being, in order for the cash outs to have an impact on the longer-term outcomes, two things have to be true. The first is that cash outs have to be sizable relative to your other economic retirement resources. And so I'm going to use the SCF to look at retirement resources across the income distribution. This is some work we've been doing lately with the SCF. And here we've taken a group, this is the 2013 survey. We're actually working on trying to construct life cycle earnings profiles based on questions that have been in the survey for many waves now to be able to really do the sorts of wonderful things you can do with the HRS where you know people's earnings over their whole lifetime. But here we're using some of that information, and just for the group right before retirement, the ones for whom we're most sure that this is good information, and we also know a lot about their labor force participation. We make some assumptions, and then what we do is we split the population into 3 groups by usual income. This is the SCF measure. It's sort of like a permanent income measure, a lifetime income measure. And the bottom 50% of the income distribution has a median of about $38,000. The next 45% has $103,000, and you can see the power of the SCF coming through here. The top 5%, the median income is about $500,000 because we're really capturing the top of the distribution. So these are the 3 groups that we're looking at. And what we do is we allocate all of the DB wealth in the economy across the population and zoom in on taking a present value of that DB wealth across these 3 groups. And then we add in the DC wealth, which is directly measured in the SCF. And we know our numbers on DC wealth track the aggregates quite well. So we're pleased about that. And here you can see the difference between, we estimate your Social Security wealth because we know roughly what your replacement rates are going to be, life expectancy, these sorts of things, and we can construct these numbers. And it really jumps out at you how much difference there is across the income distribution in terms of the relative importance of Social Security versus these retirement plans. For the bottom half of the income distribution, that $6,500 median is a couple of months working for the bottom half of the distribution. Even for the next 45%, the median is not quite 3 years of working. These are people right on the cusp of retirement. So it's really big in terms of the difference between these groups. At the top, it actually falls off a little bit, and it's only because other wealth is so much important in terms of the relative importance of retirement wealth relative to income, I should say. Okay, so these ratios, 17%, 278%, 147, but we add in Social Security. One of the messages of this table is looking at the SCF. It's not clear that the bottom 50% is so much disproportionately prepared for retirement. It's just that they're prepared through Social Security relative to their income, much the same way as the next 45. And again, at the top, that 231%, you really need to add in their other wealth in order to get that right. So the one thing is that one condition for the cash out option to matter is that it really has to be quantitatively important. I think these numbers put some suspicion on that, especially for the bottom half of the distribution, that taking the cash out just isn't going to have that big an impact on your long run outcomes because it's not quantitatively significant, 2 months work. But in the middle and the top, it could be different. And so one of the things I'd be interested in seeing also, the second condition is that the cash outs would not have to be accompanied by some other change in behavior such as working longer. And so here my suggestion is, you're using the HRS to learn more about what happened to people's outcomes. What I'd love to know is what happened to their behavior. Did the people who chose the cash out also, relative to some benchmark, choose to work longer? For example, that is a rational choice someone could make, that I might want to take the cash out when I'm 60 and then work longer. And Michael and Suzanne have done wonderful work on people's expectations about retirement. And so you could do this relative to their own expectations. Did people who took the cash out actually end up working longer than they might have reported expecting working prior to the cash out or something like that, and vice versa. So other controls also might come into play there, obviously, things like health and stuff. So my last, hope I'm not running over too much. I get asked a lot, I guess I'm a data guy, so I get asked to discuss these kind of papers, very data-driven. And over past few years, I'm developing a list of emerging life cycle inconsistent facts. So the new fact today, and I think it's confirming things that a lot of us already knew, many people take lump sum distributions from retirement accounts, especially at job separation. It's not just about shocks. It's something that happens very regularly. But in contrast, once people are in retirement, another group of papers, so David Wise is here. I think I've discussed Perturba Venti Wise papers on a number of occasions. People don't systematically draw down their 401ks and their IRAs, and Dan was telling us more about that yesterday as well. They don't systematically draw them down. There's some evidence that they will disappear over time, but it tends to be in lumps when it happens. So that's another fact. So that's not consistent with the standard model. Few people annuitize DC balances. We're going to talk about this more later. And some even de-annuitize. Is that a new word? De-annuitize DB streams. That's what part of what we learned today is that we're seeing this de-annuitization of DB streams when possible. So the other thing, and I take this again from the Retirement Preparedness Index, but other work that's being done, is that a stable retirement consumption as a percent of pre-retirement income, so right before retirement, is really not a descriptive model for most in the way that we think about behavior. But a standard life cycle model sort of predicts this flat consumption, and we tend to think about retirement policy, the goal of retirement policy, as allowing people to have that stable consumption. But I think we have lots of reasons now, including empirical evidence, as well as some theory, to tell us why that's not necessarily true. And a new fact I'll throw into your basket today is that the tax advantages for retirement accounts, most of us know they're very unequal, but you may not know how much more so they are becoming in recent years. And these are pictures that come out of the Survey of Consumer Finances, where each color line is a different birth cohort, and we're tracking them through age using grouping them by the usual income measure. So this is the bottom half of the income distribution grouped by this usual income measure, this permanent income measure. And you can see, for example, this sort of standard life cycle pattern that you get from these graphs where retirement plan coverage is going to rise with age. And so the 1941 to 50 cohort, you can see, peaked at around 65% of them had some form of coverage, and this is the bottom half of the income distribution. But if you look at the 1961 to 70 cohort, there has been no improvement over the past several waves of the SCF. They're basically stuck here in the mid-40s. The retirement plan coverage isn't improving. It's not following this life cycle trajectory. And this really doesn't bode well. And these arrows show the difference between them and the cohort ahead of them. And if you take the 1971 to 80 cohort, unless something dramatic starts happening, you could see a really big drop. The SCF also tells us that the same thing is happening with home ownership rates. We tend to think about home ownership as being something happening among the young, and what you should really be focused on is people in middle age with very low income. So it tells us something, again, about tax policy, and Michael actually started his talk with, we're worried about how our tax dollars are being spent and how they're being allocated across the population. I think that's a really fair starting point given what we're seeing. So I just want to wrap up with these emerging facts and thinking about the life cycle model and what it implies. So we have this sort of phenomenon that the biggest contrast, again, I get to discuss Perturba Venti Wise, I get to discuss this paper which says that prior to retirement, people seem ready to grab this money and do something with it. After retirement, they don't want to touch it. Right? How can that happen? What switch goes off in your head? Is this a behavioral? You could have a behavioral explanation for this, and hyperbolic discounting, I think, would be a good candidate. But if you think about it, you step back, and what we've learned about life cycle models over the past few years do actually offer you an alternative. So you need a model that generates realistic spending changes right around retirement. And for many people, this might have to do with demographic composition. Here I'm thinking about Carl Schultz and Antje Chadre and the effect of spending on kids. And it's not independent of the sort of thing that Dan was telling us yesterday. You want a model where suddenly there's a state of the world where the marginal utility of consumption is very high, right? Have children. The marginal utility of consumption is very high when you have children. And so what they showed is that there's a lot of people who are spending a lot of money right before they retire. Their spending falls dramatically because the kids are gone. They're not paying for the kids. That's something that helps us understand the difference between your pre- and post-retirement consumption, and we should have that in mind. Also, the resolution of lifetime income uncertainty is really important from a sort of buffer stock perspective. You need health in your utility function, right? I think that a life cycle model that doesn't have health and utility function is doomed to fail. I think we saw one version of it from Dan yesterday, but I think there's another version here. I think of Motohiro Yogo has done work on this, where the marginal utility of consumption is going to shift with health, but time is the key resource that goes into the production of health. We have a stochastic health production, and the thing that you need is not necessarily money is one input, that's true, but time is the other big input. And that may be something that actually causes this switch in people's thinking. My time becomes more dear as I get older. I think we need lifetime jobs that have option value. One of the things we're learning about this cohort that has this uncertain environment does seem to be responding differently to incentives around retirement. And I think agents, a model where agents are very uncertain about future potential wages after separation is key for explaining this sort of switch in behavior. And effectively, what I think these sort of models, and to resolve this pre- and post-retirement puzzle in my head, you know, where you think about what is the role of an account balance. And prior to retirement, while you're still working, you can always think about, you have the option to work more, to work a little bit longer. Every time one of my kids has a new expenditure, I just recompute how many extra weeks I have to work in order to do this. None of them have gotten married yet, but I'm sure that'll translate into months. But once you're retired, you don't have that, you may not have that option anymore. It's not as clear. And that may be the sort of thing that we need in order to help these models better explain all of these competing phenomena. And with that, thank you.